My friend Roger Pawardi might say, for me, a funny thing happened on the way to this forum. Last week I had a presentation done that responded to the 5 questions that we're posed with.
I think he'll be happier if
Okay.
you stand here, and thanks.
Okay. And then I got a message from Richard Moss saying, we put you in an urban session. You are talking about urban things, aren't you? And I said, I've done a lot of urban work, but not a single one of my slides uses the word urban. So he sort of said, do what you can. I won't tell you to throw out your stuff, but do what you can. So what I've done is to shorten my presentation on that answers the 5 questions, mainly by taking out the slides on my own career and publications, which was painful. And then I've added some stuff at the end on the urban connections as a handoff to the 2 distinguished speakers that follow me. I started out reflecting on these questions and I found it very interesting. I started graduate school 50 years ago this fall, already knowing what I was interested in. It's what we now call global sustainability, relationship between society, nature, and technological change in shaping human progress. Geography was a tolerant host for that kind of work and has been very supportive over the years, and one of the slides I took out sort of told that story a bit. But let me just say that when I came into graduate school, I found some compelling places to start. Lewis Mumford on technological change, still one of the great books on that topic. Talcott Parsons on complex social systems, a person who set a new standard in inventing jargon to make simple concepts look complicated. Environment and economics, Kenneth Boulding approaching that topic from the economic side, Howard Odum approaching it from the ecology side. Still fascinating books to read. And then Gilbert White on human responses to environmental stresses and relating science to real-world needs. Most of these, in fact, were conceptual framings, broad, simple statements of important issues that most of which are still true, not based on a lot of empirical research except for Gilbert White and his students, and to some degree Odum and his students. But it was these things that got me excited, okay? Now, since that time, what I study and how I work have been transformed almost unimaginably, at least compared to how I looked at it back 40 or 50 years ago. And I've sort of simplified these messages in 3 slides. One on changes in how we view the systems that we care about, one in changes in the global processes that concern the society around us, and one on changes in the tools available to us for data gathering and analysis. But the underlying concerns have not really changed. How we work and how we think have changed, but not the underlying concerns. Regarding changes in how we view the systems that we care about, at least in my own experience, as we've dug deeper into the world around us to find out more about it in terms of empirical work, we've found ever greater complexities within these systems and between them, adding to what we know that we do not know, and more things that we're uncertain about. The systems themselves have not necessarily become more complex, but we've increased our appreciation for the complexities and the challenges of understanding them in comprehensive and integrated ways. It's been said that Mother Earth never stops reminding us that we should be humble in pretending to understand how she works. It seems to me in the things that I study and know about, our knowledge has increased enormously, but at the same time our uncertainties have also increased, or at least our awareness of those uncertainties, or the amount of time we spend talking about them. Another point that's been brought up during the meeting here is that because we have seen that these systems are so complex, we have put more emphasis on large interdisciplinary team projects from biocomplexity to integrated assessment modeling, a major change from 30 or 40 years ago. Secondly, changes in the global processes that concern the society around us. I'm not sure this is so true for those of us in the room who are atmospheric climate scientists, but for those of us who look at global change as involving more than just climate change, or for those of us who come to climate change mainly interested in implications for human dimensions of climate impacts and responses, we have to pay attention to other things that are changing in the world around us. Changes in global processes that matter, such as the globalization of economic systems. When I did my PhD work in the Gangetic Plain in India in the late 60s, looking at what we now call technology transfer. The concerns about international trade and food were getting food to developing countries whose citizens were starving because they weren't raising enough to feed them. There was no vision of a time in the future when the main concern would be with the exploitation by multinational firms of developing countries in order to make the lives of the rich better. Globalization of threats to security other than from nuclear war. Terrorism has emerged and become a major factor in our lives and how all of our systems relate to each other. Globalization of threats to health, HIV, influenza, Ebola, that have become a major part of the news around us and the context within which we try to relate climate to development in a comprehensive way. Globalization of environmental threats, not just climate change, but pesticides and asbestos and mercury and other things that people worry about. And globalization and acceleration of science and technology development. Kenneth Bowling in one of his books said, is technology the culprit or the savior? And his answer and mine was, it's nearly often a culprit, but it can be a savior depending on how we choose and use the technology. Many implications of these changes for the societies around us that are dealing with climate change is one more stress. Expansion of options for livelihoods and lifestyles, whole new categories of jobs, transformation of the ways we live our lives at a workplace and home, especially with the IT options for communication and entertainment. Expansion of awareness of information events, including both things we can find out about related to our work, related to our lives, what hotel we're going to choose for our trip, and also about things that we worry about, such as copycat violence enabled by these kinds of changes. And a heightened sense of regional differences and comparative advantage for job creation and well-being, as nearly anybody can get involved in providing us with cars or television sets or fresh vegetables in our stores. The third change, and it's one that we've heard from some this week, especially people like Gossam and others with the remote sensing background. We've had changes in capacities for gathering information, remote sensing and sensors. The bottom image comes from the North Carolina University work on land use in the Amazon. New capacities for recording and storing information. New capacities for analyzing information, the computing IT revolution. When I got into this business, we were just graduating from mechanical calculators to great big decks of punch cards that we took to a computing center in the evening and left overnight to be run on the small, slow, clunky computers there, and you went back in the morning hoping you would have a stack of printouts. That is so far away from the way we work now. Students now can't imagine that kind of context for work. They can't imagine how we ever got anything done. We're not too sure looking back on it ourselves. Another thing that's changed is paradigms and terminologies for addressing our topics. Such things as sustainability and resilience were not things that we talked about back in the 70s and 80s. The Brundtland Commission released this report in 1987. Some terms that were in use back then are used a lot more now, like risk and scale, trade-offs and so on. I think if you compared the language that was used, the terms that were used in the AGCI workshops back in the 80s with the terminologies that are being used now, you would see the lexicon has changed a whole lot. That not only reflects changes in how we talk, it also reflects changes in how we think. And finally, new capacities for communicating information from television to social media that not only involve how we talk to each other, but how the world around us hears about our work and becomes aware of it. So those are some examples of ways that my world has changed over the last 30 or 40 years or so. Where my parts of global change science are going over the next generation or two, here are the two kinds of points I want to make. There are going to be changes in the driving forces that shape support for our science and uses of our science. And there are going to be further changes in the assets available to us to support scientific progress. I'm going to just illustrate these, actually 2 slides for the first point and 1 slide for the second one. But the underlying concerns have not really changed. We continue to work on the same kinds of questions. We just have different ways of operating and pursuing our interest and our interest in the world around us. Regarding changes in driving forces that shape support for and uses of our science, this reflects the world, the parts of global change science that I'm involved in myself. They're increasingly driven by focal events that focus societal attention on big issues related to our science. So big questions that are related to crises, to disruptions, to worries, the kinds of things that get the attention of society, to news media, and to decision makers. How bad is our climate change becoming? Is it time for geoengineering? What's happening with global population growth? What does that mean in terms of pressures on resources, waste generation, institutional performance, and equity? Where are resources and their services facing limitations? The oil crisis in the 1970s. What are emerging crises related to security, health, and well-being? Those, in my world, are increasingly driving the kind of support that we can find for the science that we want to pursue. A few other driving forces, obviously accelerating emergence of advanced IT and computational technologies and capacities. I think these things are going to change more in the next 20 years than they have in the last 20 years, which is a daunting prospect to think about. Issues related to science as a threat. This is an emerging theme that will, I think, probably increase in strength over the next several decades. Genetic engineering is something that society associates with risks. Privacy is something society associates with things that science can do to threaten that, which includes also the potentials to reduce intellectual property rights concerns as a constraint on our ability to communicate our knowledge. Nanobiology, the potential within 50 years that people will be able to change their bodies by drinking a potion if they can afford to buy it. More related to our science, I think we're going to see demands and potentials for linking process paradigms with spatial paradigms related to increasing expectations of visualization for both heuristics and communication. We have society around us, especially the younger age cohorts, that grow up looking at everything on screens, and that's going to be something that we need to cope with in talking about what we do. And finally, chronic budget constraints. I see no real prospect that budgets for the kind of things we do, total budgets, are going to grow a lot in the next 10 or 20 years. And in my world, at least, we're facing increasing questions about the value from and priorities for investments in our science, with relevance becoming more important as a priority funding. We hear from agencies, I've heard in the last several months, if it's not contributing to making the world better, what's the payoff? Don't obsess about uncertainties, give us useful advice. We may see a shift away from focus on reducing uncertainties toward developing robust strategies for action given uncertainties. But if you combine this with the event-driven focus, I think we see an increasing stress between the people who believe it's really important to maintain work on the fundamental science, and people who say, well, given budget limitations, we can't afford all that. So at the margin, we have to increase the attention to the problems that matter to us more right now. And I think it's something we need to think about in terms of the issue for this workshop as a kind of a stress, to anticipate, to prepare for, and to figure out how to cope with. And then further changes in the assets available to us to support our progress. And I'm going to just mention 3 examples from among a larger number of possible ones. One is, I think that over the next decade or 2, we're going to see a lot more attention to large-scale computational modeling of complex issues that are not amenable to experimentation. Through most of our careers, we've limited our imagination by saying there's so many things that we can't compute, there's no need to even think about them too much. Well, we're approaching a time when limits to computational capacities are going to almost disappear. If you look at the speed in terms of petaflops of the frontier computers, the people who maintain these computers, including Oak Ridge, don't tell you that they're having trouble finding uses of this expanding capacities because the ideas are not there. But we're going to see new capacities for examining multiple drivers, complex feedbacks, nonlinearities, discontinuities. In other words, the capacity to anticipate tipping points before they emerge so that we can figure out what to do about them. We're going to see more use of multi-criteria optimization, which Igor talked about yesterday. We're going to see increasing potentials for linking different forms of data, including quantitative and qualitative data. All that's very exciting to think about. A second example of a change in assets available to us, I think, is advances in observational data gathering, including increased options for sensing things we want to see. And it's not just physical world, the natural science world, it's also the human world where we're going to be able to do more with data gathering. And toward the end of the urban thing, I'm going to give you an example from the New York City Center for Urban Science and Progress, CUSP. I think they invented the CUSP acronym and then came up with a name to fit the acronym. And then we're going to see increased democratization, participation in global change analysis linked with the IT revolution. A much more widespread awareness of issues, knowledge, and who's doing what. Maybe more co-production of knowledge, including co-production between scientists and users of the knowledge. Okay, let me quickly suggest, I think there's a danger that growing quantitative data sources and growing quantitative analytical capacities will move science even farther away from global change issues that can't be fully captured by quantitative metrics, issues like institutional change, aggregate well-being, sense of place, and so on. And let me just quickly suggest a few ideas for workshops. A workshop on large-scale computational simulation of geoengineering interventions and their implications, on improving the capacity to anticipate tipping points, on frontiers in visualization, on incorporating qualitative issues and data in our science, and improving the understanding of process linkages that cross geographical scales. Okay, now a quick switch to urban in about 3 or 4 minutes. For decades, urban areas and processes were at the margins of attention to core issues in global change. They got very little attention. They were largely overlooked as priorities because people said, urban things are localized phenomena. They're not a sector. Urban is not a sector. It's not a discipline. It's rather untidy to study. It's more engineering than science, and it doesn't have sustained sources of support anyway, so there are other things for us to study. But so often urban areas are at the heart of the kinds of vulnerabilities and impacts that most people care about. And so this is changing. An example of the lack of attention over the years is that urban was not defined as a chapter topic in IPCC's Working Group 2 until the 5th assessment report. And it didn't become a chapter of the U.S. National Climate Assessment until the 3rd assessment report. But there are reasons for it to be a topic of interest. I'm going to move through this very quickly. Urban areas are where most of the Earth's population lives. Urban population is growing rapidly. This kind of indicates what's happening. Non-urban population across the world is leveled out. Urban population was growing, and the total global population reflects the curve in urban population. That means that if the total global population increases by 1 billion, the urban population of the world is increasing by 1 billion. 1 billion is the equivalent of 100 cities of 10 million people each, added to the urban areas in the world already. And how in the world can we cope with that sustainably? Urban areas are of interest because population concentrations present special risks of human system catastrophes. They're often the location of a large share of a nation's most disadvantaged citizens. They're often located in areas that are vulnerable to climate change impacts, such as coastal areas and river valleys. They're focused on many driving forces that are important for all of our concern with global change. Financial centers, industrial centers, media centers, innovation centers, and where democratic processes are used for decision making. If most of the people are in urban areas, that's where most of the votes are to determine what happens. So urban areas matter, and there are a lot of significant institution building initiatives underway. I've listed some of them here, the International Human Dimensions Project and others. There's been strong recent U.S. agency interest in vulnerabilities of urban areas to disruptive weather events and strategies to increase their resilience. In fact, AGCI was an early player in this arena. The 1997 initial climate change assessment at AGCI took a vote among the people at the given center at the time about what's the highest research priority for impact-related climate science. And they said that it's integrating human and natural systems to understand climate change with a particular focus on urban services. That led to a 1999 workshop on integrating human and natural systems to understand climate change impacts on cities. Don Webbles was here for that. and it led directly to such initiatives as the Boston Climate Change Impact Assessment. Lakshmanan was here, and that assessment changed the careers of Paul Kirshen and Matthias Ruth and some other people who are important in our community now. This interest to urban areas has been stimulated by a succession of disruptive events in recent years, extreme weather events, failures of aging urban infrastructures, and so the interest in this is growing as we speak. And there are a number of high priority directions for urban research that these different initiatives are identifying. Improving the understanding of resilience as an attribute of urban areas and how to enhance it. Improving the understanding of complex linkages among the different parts of urban systems. Pursuing synergies between climate change adaptation and mitigation in urban areas. Considering possible requirement for transformational changes in some urban areas that are facing problems with things like sea level rise and coastal storms. Let me just finally mention this one, using approved sensor capabilities and coupling them with real-time resilience movement enhancement and quality of life improvement, because it's so interesting. The New York Center at NYU is connecting with the city government to say we want to be able to measure the pulse of this city, to understand the city from time to time, and they're using an enormous array of sensors so that they can produce an hourly map of noise levels in the city. They can use records of every taxi ride in the city over the past several years, the time of day, the origin and destination, to show movements and how that changes from weekdays to weekends. They're using information gathered from every public security camera in the city and some private security cameras to monitor what's going on and to figure out how to put this together. This is the sort of thing that has the potential to change how we do our work in global change research. Thanks.
Thanks, Tom. Great.